Hi, I'm Tim Byrne. This is Tim Byrne Almost Live. It's Monday, November 11th. It's Remembrance Day. And I thought I'd do a little special edition of Tim Byrne Almost Live. It's a little story. It's going to last about 13 minutes, so I hope you like it. Never give in. Never, never, never. In nothing great or small, large or petty, never give in, except to the convictions of honor and good sense. Never yield to the forces. Never yield to the apparent overwhelming might of the enemy. It was October 29th, 1941. Churchill said this at the Harrow School. This was just outside of central London. This is the school he attended as a child. My grandmother, aged 17, stood in that schoolyard that day with thousands of men and women listening on. Unbeknownst to her, my grandfather was also in that audience. Their fate was yet to be determined. 1.1 million Canadians fought in World War II, 21% of the adult Canadian population. Most of them were men. 55,000 were wounded. 45,000 Canadian soldiers died. 15 million soldiers died in total in the battles of World War II. This story is just of one survivor, my grandmother. She was a sergeant in the Air Force. She ran a balloon brigade. It was the anti-aircraft. It was the only way they could fight the German bombers coming over the English Channel. Often they were called out at 3 a.m. as needed, and they would drive to the English Channel, the beaches, just before the Luftwaffe flew over top of the English Channel to bomb England. My grandmother told me those sounds of the Luftwaffe bombers would sound like bees in her ears. They would resonate. She said they would drone in her head. She would touch her eardrum. Deep, deep sounds. She could only just hear them. She could never see them in the darkness. My grandmother was in charge of one Jeep and 3 men with her. Those Jeeps would go out at 2 a.m. whenever called by their commanding officer, and at 3 a.m. they would drive to those beaches of the English Channel and dig a hole. The size of the Jeep, about 10 feet across, 5 or 6 feet wide, 5 feet down. They'd pull the Jeep over top at around 4 a.m. and cover that Jeep with sand. There'd be one Jeep every 200 meters, 30 Jeeps across. This truly was England's last chance to stop the Nazi war machine from attacking England. At 5 a.m., they would attach helium balloons that they would hook up to wire cables off their Jeeps and tether them high up in the sky, around 4,000 feet. There'd be 4 of these hot air balloons and 4 cables attached to each Jeep. There's about 120 cables in total. Every 200 meters, there was one Jeep, about 30 Jeeps across, drifting them up high in the sky. They'd wait in silence. At 6 a.m., they would climb under their Jeeps, and they would wait for the sound of those bees, those Luftwaffe bombers, to come across the English Channel. These low-flying killing machines, these bombers, the sound of bees in my grandmother's ears. They would sit under those Jeeps in darkness, waiting. It'd be cold, it'd be raining, she said, and they'd be scared to death. She could hear her captain's orders resonate in her head prior to the attack. Screw the damn Nazis. Screw the Geneva Convention. It's us or them. Do you understand me? And she said we'd all yell at him, yes, sir. He would continue and say, we have no food to feed the bastards, so wait until the fires stop. And then if you're still alive, God bless, dig your way out and look for the parachutes. And as soon as you see the whites of their eyes, you kill them. And he would scream at them, do you understand me? And she said we'd all yell back, yes, sir. My grandmother told me she didn't actually understand what he meant when he said, when the fires stop. Kenneth, her mate, her companion, part of her troop, used to bring 4 lavatory buckets with him from the latrines every time they went out. And while they all dug the holes, he would fill them up with seawater and bring them back to the Jeep and have Pam, that's my grandmother, put them underneath the Jeep with the other guys. You know, I was 13 years old the first time she told me this story. I didn't actually understand what she was telling me, and it took me probably until I'm 52 to really realize what she gave up so that we could have our freedom. She'd sit in her small kitchen table at her house in Markham, hot tea in her hand, and she'd blow the steam off of it and push the cigarette smoke out of her nose like a bowl. She'd never make eye contact with me as I sat across that table from her, no emotion. And she just said those bees, Timmy, got louder. So loud we couldn't even talk. We were underneath those jeeps, and that drone of bees, the sound louder and louder. She said my heart would race. We were so scared. And then like an earthquake, the jeeps would lurch up and back and lift off the ground and be heaved around and pulled. And she would be lying in the darkness, and there'd be a ray of light that came in underneath the jeep. And then the jeep would slam back down to the ground, off center to where the hole was originally, and they were fully exposed. Kenneth would scream at her, "Pam, cover your damn face, Pam!" She said I could hear him screaming at me. My eyes were clenched closed. That wasn't sunlight she saw. It was the fuel of the planes exploding as the wings got ripped off as they hit the steel cables. And those explosions were happening right over top of their head. My grandmother's eyes were cold and blank. You could tell she didn't like telling the story, but she had to. Her heart was racing, and the flames danced all around her, smashing to the ground. She could hear those screams in the darkness of people burning to death. The heat of the flames was so hot she was sweating, yet it was cold. You could see her breath. There was fire everywhere. Kenneth would scream at her, "Pam, shoot! Shoot now, Pam!" Kenneth was standing with a pistol in his hand outside of the jeep, outside of the hole they dug, and he was shooting into the white clouds of the parachutes of the Nazi soldiers coming down, the pilots. My grandmother said she could hear German words being screamed in the darkness. She knew that those German words were begging for mercy. She couldn't understand what they were saying, but she knew they were scared as she was. Kenneth just screamed at her. You'd know, she said, you knew he'd done this before. Kenneth screamed, "Now, shoot, Pam, shoot." And Pam laid on her back, eyes closed, and shot into the darkness, not knowing where she was shooting. She could feel the rain fall on her face, and she'd wipe her eyes, and she said to me, "Timmy, that wasn't rain, that was falling on my face." It was the blood of a German pilot. My grandmother would crush out her cigarette, and she'd sip her tea. And she'd reach her hand onto mine. After it was all over, the commanding officer came to them and said, "The ammunition dump, where we stored all our ammunition, will be moved closer to the schoolhouse. Very close to where they would be having the anti-aircraft balloons the next morning." And her commanding officer believed that the Luftwaffe knew that the ammunition dump had been moved, and they would be a target. It was 12 noon, they made it back to camp, made it back to where their tents were, their barracks. They washed up and had a nap, had some food in silence, sat in the mess tent. Kenneth, with a mouthful of food, whispered over to Pam and said, Let's go." And as they walked into town, Pam said she could hear that music playing in the background, way in the distance. And there was laughter. Kenneth had brought her to a hall where they could dance and drink. And she forgot about the war just for a few minutes. She told me she met my grandfather that night. Oh, and she loved him. They thought that was going to be the last day of their lives. They thought for sure the Germans would make it through tomorrow. So that night, they danced and they kissed. And for a single moment, there was no war. There was no death. She told me how much she loved that Canadian boy. And she never did see him again. She lit another cigarette and quietly said to me, "I never made it to my post the next morning. None of my group did. We were hungover, no idea where we were. And then in the dreams, the sounds in my dreams of those bees. She could hear them as she woke up. And that day, those bombers made it through. Hundreds of children died because my grandmother never stopped those bombers. 9 months later, my mother was born. My grandmother went to my great-grandmother and begged her to take my mom to Canada. She told them to go run away, and she'd find them after the war was over. I promise I'll come find you. And with the kettle whistling in the background, my grandmother said to me, I hope you never see what I saw, and I hope you never take for granted what you have. God bless you, Granny. Pamela Barnard, you're an awesome lady, and I miss you. That's her. About 1945 in the Air Force. Thank you, Granny. Thank you for making sure we have our freedom. I'm Tim Byrne. This is Tim Byrne Almost Live. Take a few seconds and just remember what you got. Take care.